Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. I am your usual host, Colin McFader, along with my lovely co-host, Clark Coffey.
Hey, so wait a minute. So you're usual and I'm lovely. Is that what that's the titles that you've given us?
You are a little bit extraordinary, so there you go.
Okay, so I'm extraordinary. Okay,
I'm the norm.
You're more than just usual, right? Or regular. I mean, I would consider you exceptional as well. But anyway,
we've got to be humble. But today we are doing a movie that I honestly had not thought about for a very long time, which was your choice, Carrie.
Yes.
1976, not the 2013 remake, of course. The 1976
absolutely.
original.
Yep.
And Brian De Palma, who I think both of us are big fans of, even though he's kind of, squared away from the limelight a little bit recently.
A little bit, and it's a shame. Yeah, in the 2000s, he's been relegated to kind of Euro films, small budgets, and not a lot of publicity or exposure. But yeah, I mean, I think that he's one of my favorite filmmakers. But even he kind of falls off my radar even. And I have to kind of, remind myself like, hey, wait a minute. Oh, hold on, man. This guy has got one hell of a filmography. And and it was tough to pick the film, because there's a lot of things that I could have picked. And I was kind of, trying to figure out what to pick. And, of course, like right off the bat, 1981's Blowout came to mind first. And I'm thinking that's, I consider that probably the pinnacle. It's definitely a masterpiece. I kind of consider that
to be fantastic. Yeah.
It's a fantastic film. And I thought, well, maybe that's, I don't know. Is that a little too obvious, though? Has that been covered, so many times that it might be kind of a situation of diminishing returns here? Yeah. That I thought for maybe a second Casualties of War. And I actually think that's a pretty amazing film as well. I thought for a second Scarface, and clearly Scarface is probably his most commercially, in today's day and age. I mean, it has gone on to have such a life of its own.
It's got its own pop culture thing.
It's its own huge pop culture thing. But I thought, it might be interesting to revisit that, try to like scrape away all that kind of pop culture artifice, and really kind of revisit the film itself again. But then I landed on this, and I think a big part of that is because this film was released in '76. I was born in '76. I saw this film when I was very young because it was a very commercially successful film. It played, on TV and everywhere when I was a kid, and so I saw the film when I was young, and it was just really impactful. For a couple different reasons, which we're going to kind of get into. But so I thought, hey, what the hell, Carrie? Plus, I love horror films, which I feel like this film is barely a horror film. It's only in the the final 30 minutes that I think it earns that horror film genre title. But it is definitely, I mean, it's very much feels like a genre film, and I love genre films. I love exploitation, and I think
it's interesting too because it's sort of much in the way that, again, and we'll get into this in a lot greater detail, but like much in the way that Hitchcock movies aren't. Most, I would say, about even Hitchcock's scariest movies are probably 80% drama, more so than scares or suspense or thrills or anything like that.
Right.
And De Palma, who very much is clearly heavily inspired by as most of that group of filmmakers were by Hitchcock. That you almost get a similar kind of structure of movie here, where it's like a lot of it is about character and development of
building
this tension, which I think is brilliantly done here. Again, I hadn't seen this movie since I was in grade 7. I think the first time, grade 7 or grade 8 was the first time I watched it.
It's been forever for me too. Yeah, I haven't seen the movie,
which was last year.
Yeah, I love it.
But no, I always remember my dad would have been 21 when this came out, I think.
Yeah.
And he always talked about it when I was a kid. Like, it was always one of those movies that he would always mention. Psycho, which I'd seen when I was very young.
Yeah.
Because my dad was a huge Hitchcock fan.
Yeah.
And or is. But he always talked about this movie having been one where it was like him and his brother were watching it, and the ending scared them so much that they ran out of the room and jumped over the couch. And
you've got to watch it.
I remember thinking, like, me and my friend Evan, who I'm still really good friends with, who's works with me on films today.
Shout out to Evan.
Yeah, hey Evan. He we just decided one day to like watch it in his basement after school, and we did. And I remember at the time thinking it was dated, but it was like not a negative aspect of it. Like I was like, this is a very 70s movie, but I really was kind of like jiving with it. Like I liked it.
Well, the cinematography is very, and we'll talk about this a little bit too, but that, the usage of the pro mist and the,
oh God, yeah.
and the zooms. I mean, there's definitely things that bring you into the 70s world, but I'm curious then. So, the first time I saw the film was certainly, it was on television. It was some kind of broadcast, and it could have been, cable or well, it could have been cable or some kind of broadcast. It was almost certainly edited for content for broadcast. How did you first see it? Was this VHS? I'm trying to think, because you're young, so it could have been DVD. It would have either been,
I mean, when I was young, like when I was still kind of in my youth, it was VHS was kind of the dominant thing.
Yeah.
Probably until I was about in middle school, or maybe a little late elementary.
Well, because you said 7th grade, so I'm
thinking, so I think we might have watched this on VHS though. I don't think it was like, at least we didn't have the DVD. Yeah. 4x3. You're sitting there with the scratchy audio because it was probably a tape that had been worn down to
pan and scan,
God knows where.
And you've got
exactly. But no, I mean, again, just as an aside, it's always so funny to think back to watching things like that in that format, because it didn't seem poor quality at all, at least when I was
Well, it's
young.
what you had.
Yeah, like it was. I remember thinking that it was amazing.
It was like, it was so like clear. You were so thrilled just to be able to watch a film at home. Who cares? I mean, nobody knew anything else. I didn't know anything different. I mean, except of course, when you went to the theater, you had widescreen aspect ratios, but of course at home everything was 4:3.
Well, that was what made the theater special, right?
That's what made it special. And I mean, look, I had a black and white TV until I was 12.
Hey,
I
had a black and white TV for a while too, but I think that was more just because it was so old.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, I mean, I remember thinking, especially like if when I would go rent a VHS tape, right, and you could kind of tell, right, if you got a tape that was new versus if you got a tape that had been watched, 1,000 times or 10,000 times, and I'd be so excited. I was like, oh, I can tell it's new, and I'd pop it in and you'd be like, oh wow, it's so crisp. I mean, oh my gosh, the picture quality is so great. You remember how on older tapes it would start to warp. It would warp,
and or there would be one slice of the screen that would be like slightly left or something.
It wouldn't track. Yeah, there was something off with tracking or who knows what, or would start to lose its demagnetize over time,
and
or
the
whatever.
Staticky sound.
Yeah.
Which but again, it's funny to that before this would have been the only way that I'd seen this movie. And I liked it a lot then. It just, what's funny is that when I say that it's a movie that I hadn't thought about in a long time, it's not necessarily that I'd forgotten about it, but rather that it's a movie that I watched and it was kind of in like the repertoire of movies that I felt like I needed to watch, and then I did it, and then just kind of was like, cool, and then moved on from it. And then when you had recommended it, and I was like, that's an interesting one, because I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how I was going to respond to it, because it had been so long since I'd seen it.
Well, I didn't know either, and because I hadn't seen it since I was very young too, so it's been a long time. And I do have to say though, part of why I picked it, why it was at the top of my mind, was that I was kind of going on a little bit of a De Palma bender. So I had De Palma on the brain. Criterion Streaming has got a handful of his films. They've got Murder a la Mode. Nice. They've got Sisters. They've got Body Double, and they've got Blowout. So I've been taking advantage of Criterion, their streaming service, and they are not a paid sponsor, but I do have to say that I highly recommend Criterion streaming service. By the way, I'm not sure if they have it in Canada, but they've got it out down here in the States. They do. It's like dirt cheap too. I want to say it's like maybe $6 or $9 or something a month. I mean, they have commentary tracks, they have extras, featurettes, on a lot of their films, just as they would on their physical media releases. I mean, it's outstanding. Anyway, so I was kind of on a De Palma bender, and it just revisit some of his films I'd never seen, some of his films I hadn't seen in a long time. And I was kind of really grooving on De Palma, and so that's what kind of had this top of mind. So let's talk a little bit about context of the film. Because I think this is, I mean, Brian De Palma is a really interesting filmmaker to me, and a part of that interest is kind of, his. The era in which he came to making films, and his, he's kind of considered a part of the, the movie brat.
This huge line of those new Hollywood filmmakers,
heavy hitters,
Spielberg, Lucas, Scorsese, Coppola,
Schrader, Milius, and some of them, of course, Spielberg, Lucas, and Scorsese and Coppola. I mean, some of the most successful filmmakers who have ever lived. You look at Spielberg and Lucas, you've got some of the most commercially successful filmmakers ever. I mean, I think it's between the two of them, and maybe it's Spielberg, but I mean, we're talking combined box offices that are just astronomical. I mean, it's just insane.
In the billions.
I think maybe only Cameron. I don't know if Cameron is ahead of Spielberg, or
I think Spielberg's ahead just because of volume.
Just sheer volume. He's been making films since the 70s. So. But I mean, that's a pretty wild group of filmmakers to be a part of, and and
they were all friends. I mean,
they were all friends.
They hung out.
I mean, Carrie was actually cast right alongside. Lucas was casting Star Wars, and De Palma was right there in the sessions, and they were kind of cross casting their films. It's just like it's kind of mind blowing. I can only imagine. I mean, I've always been intrigued by De Palma because it's, he just took a different track. And I think it's conscious, it's not like, he has the skill, he has the talent, there isn't anything inherently that would, it's just his choice. I think his choice of subject matter, his choice of execution, and I'm appreciative of it. I mean,
I've always weirdly thought that Cronenberg and De Palma were similar, that David Cronenberg was sort of a similar director in that he almost refused the larger window of kind of like big budget Hollywood for something a little bit more, I guess, just kind of under the radar in a weird way.
I mean, I think personal. I think I would say maybe a little, especially with Cronenberg, more. I think personal. I think exploitive. I think a quote on a bad when people describe De Palma and they're trying to be derogatory, they call him trashy. I think the same things that people. Some people call trashy in De Palma, I find to be interesting. I mean, I love exploitation films. I love B films. I love genre films. I grew up on them. I mean, it's like, I've already talked about how I would sneak peeks when my parents would have, company over viewing parties when I was a little kid, and they would rent, the cheesiest, most genre pictures possible. And I would, watch them like hiding in the back of the house, like, reflected in a mirror so they couldn't see me, but I could see the screen kind of thing. I mean, I have a strong affinity for these kind of films. And I think that De Palma, he takes those. It's almost like, I feel like Quentin Tarantino in a certain sense. Quentin's a big B movie, exploitation movie, genre movie fan. And he takes those aspects of those films and turns them into high art.
And they've got so much character,
and I feel like De Palma could be. Yeah. You could say the same thing about De Palma.
Absolutely, yeah. And I actually referenced De Palma recently when I was teaching a film class to high school kids these days, and I sort of said that I was comparing kind of older, especially with the movie brats like Scorsese and them, with kind of more contemporary filmmakers, and more specifically the Marvel movies. And I was sort of said that because a lot of people that age love the Marvel movies, and so I sort of said, that's totally cool. You can like what you want, and if you get enjoyment out of something, that's great. But I think that you kind of have to consciously notice that when you watch a De Palma movie or Scorsese or any of them, you immediately know that you're watching a De Palma movie just by the way the camera moves and the way that the like just the look and the feel of everything. It just kind of exudes these people's personalities just on the screen. And there's kind of this weird thing where there are some directors today surely that are very much still like that. But I think it's a shame that on a large grand scale that there's this development of film that's come to the forefront, especially of box offices, which is that you shouldn't take notice to a director. That as a director, you're there to manage a set, and that's it. And so if we're gonna shoot a big battle scene, we just need to set up 6 cameras and get it. And that's
on
that.
purpose.
And then
I mean, that's on purpose because they want the IP to lead the way. Now, not to get like too down in a path that's not about De Palma and this film, but I mean that's on purpose. They want the IP to lead the way. They don't even want the actors representing those IPs to necessarily be the reason that you go in. That's why costumes are so fantastic and CGI is so fantastic in their mind, because it's not even the actor that you care about. It's the IP. It's Captain America. It's the Hulk. And anybody can play it, and anybody can direct it. And frankly, anybody can write it, because it's the concept that you care about.
I don't think Scorsese was wrong when he described them as amusement parks.
And there's nothing wrong with that either. I think a lot of people thought it was
their
like
undies
in a bind. Yeah, they got their undies in a bind because they're like, wait a minute, I like those films. Are you saying that I'm a lesser person because I like these films? No, he's just saying that cinema, like what he thinks is cinema, and I agree with him too. Like what I would call cinema is not a Marvel movie, but it is what De Palma makes. And what is the difference? Well, I think a big part of it is what we're discussing right here, which is that one of them is, the cinema stems forth from as an authentic, artistic expression from a director.
It's authored, yeah.
It's authored.
It's an authored
It's
film,
curated, and it is meticulous, and every image is there on purpose because somebody put it there, and that's the director. Ultimately, obviously, it's a collaborative art form, and don't mean to diminish that it takes hundreds of people or thousands of people sometimes to make a film like this, but ultimately, the director is at the helm. It's a director's medium. It's like television is a writer's medium, but Marvel films are not that.
Yeah,
they are not that.
And to even more specify with De Palma, it's like the split diopter in this movie. There's a lot of split diopter shots, which I love. A lot of people actually don't like the split diopter that much because they think it kind of is too in your face, but I love it.
Yeah, some people think it's obtrusive, it draws attention to itself, that it's not seamless, that and I love it too.
Let's talk a bit about the cinematography of this film.
Real quick, before we do, there's real quick, not to cut you off, because I want to get to that too, because there's some really interesting stuff in the cinematography, but just while we're kind of talking a little bit about context, about De Palma being a part of this movie brats group, and and we've hinted at it a little bit. I think you brought up Hitchcock. I think it's really important to mention that this film and much of De Palma's work is or maybe all, frankly, of his work is heavily influenced by Hitchcock.
Oh, and you can more so than anybody else.
I think probably more so than any other major filmmaker I'm familiar with. Obviously, Hitchcock has inspired countless filmmakers, but as far as people of a certain stature, I can't think of anybody who's been more influenced than De Palma, and that's a great thing if you love Hitchcock, and I'm a big fan of Hitchcock, so that fits for me. I mean, but he's even made almost straight up recreations. I mean, for example, I told you I just watched Body Double. I mean, it's practically a remake of Vertigo in some senses. Certainly an homage. I mean,
which is what I think is so interesting about De Palma, is that his style there it's not just the visual cues of Hitchcock, right. the visual language of him,
and the score.
It's the storytelling too.
It's the storytelling
that I think that's what separates De Palma from so many other people. That Spielberg is someone that is often in that group cited as being similar to Hitchcock as well, which I agree with. There's certainly elements of Spielberg's filmmaking that definitely he will even say, I got that from Hitchcock,
right?
But I always think it's funny that people kind of leave De Palma out in those conversations, because I think De Palma 10 times more than Spielberg is a Hitchcock protege.
Well, and the thing is that he can back it up too, So it's one thing to say that you're influenced by Hitchcock or whatever XYZ filmmaker, and it's one thing to say that this is an homage, or it's one thing to kind of steal. But look, you got to have the skill to back that up, and I think De Palma really does. I mean, and this film that we're discussing here, or we'll eventually discuss as we kind of lay down some general context. But I mean, talk about this film is a masterclass in anticipation, in suspense.
Oh God, yeah.
In building suspense, in and bringing the audience so actively into the process of imagining what's about to happen, what we know is going to happen, anticipating what's going to happen. I mean, this whole movie, from the first scene, the setup, where we have the girls tormenting Carrie in the locker room, everything that happens after that, up until the bucket of blood scene and its immediate aftermath at the prom. I mean, the entire movie is building up. We know what's about to happen.
Well, I think you described it sort of. It's like a train wreck in slow motion. Like it's like you know that all of all the pieces are set, and you're just waiting for them to collide.
And he sets it up so beautifully.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, even the mechanics of it, and maybe this is a good segue to go into cinematography if you're ready to go there. But just everything is motivated. And, and there are some complex camera moves here. There's some really interesting, and you talked about diopter shots, but they're there for a reason. There's this wonderful, I think maybe the best one, or the diopter shot that really stood out to me, it's especially beautiful, was the scene where Tommy is having his plagiarized poetry read in class. And we have Tommy in focus on one half of the screen, and he's sitting in front of Carrie, and she is a few seats back, and we see her in focus as well, and the teacher is reading this poem, and the teacher asks for critique from the class, and Carrie says that it's beautiful. And then the teacher goes on to ridicule her for, saying, well, that's one hell of a critique, beautiful is not a critique, what are you talking about? But you can see there's so many things that we're doing here. We can see Carrie's reaction to the ridicule. We see Tommy actually genuinely reacting to her saying something nice about him, and that sets up something that's really important, that Tommy actually is like a decent human being, it seems like, and he actually does really genuinely care for Carrie, and he's actually is having a good time at prom.
Got the empathy for her,
and then of course we see that he's nonetheless a victim. That doesn't save him. He's actually knocked out by the bucket, so his own friends take him out, and that's an interesting kind of some dramatic irony there. But it's just one example. I mean, it's a great shot, but it's not just there to be there.
Well, and then there's the other part where she comes out of the prayer closet thing while her mother's sewing, and it's like the mother never looks back at her. She just keeps sewing and is doing this. And again, I think
so
one of the things that is so great about the split diopter is that as a director, I love to play things out in kind of longer, uninterrupted takes. Not necessarily oneers per se, but just allowing actors to perform in a master. And the split diopter is a great tool for that, because if you have two actors who are separated by a lot of space, and one of them is much closer to the camera than the other, you kind of have two options, or three really. I can either stop down the lens a ton, so you have a really deep depth of field, which means you need way more light, or you can rack focus back and forth between the two, which can be difficult if they're overlapping dialogue or just distracting generally.
And it means something different to do that.
It feels different.
You're pushing, pulling. You're still not splitting focus simultaneously. It's a jumping back and forth of focus,
Which is why I've always thought the idea that the split diopter is distracting or something like that is weird, because to me it's the least distracting way to do that, because you're just letting it sit. You don't really have to do any movement of camera afterwards, and you can let the actors do their thing, which I think is really I'm assuming that's one of the reasons De Palma probably likes it a lot as well. And just as we get into the visuals of the movie specifically, I also want to say that while De Palma is incredibly influenced by Hitchcock, and very clearly so, he has so much of his own flavor in his movies as well. Like that it's not that De Palma is taking from Hitchcock's style and using it everywhere. It's just rather that Hitchcock, or rather De Palma, seems almost like a natural evolution of Hitchcock's work. In that he brought a lot of his own tendencies and voice to his filmmaking, while looking back at someone like Hitchcock and going, okay, how does he, why were Hitchcock's movies so effective, and how did he do that? And I think, again, which really makes me love De Palma, and which is why I've always really liked him, is this idea that he does, he just kind of analyzes that stuff and goes like, why does that work? What makes that tick? And, how can I play the audience up like that in the same way that Hitchcock did? So I think it's really remarkable how effective of a filmmaker he is in that way. And then
And I was just going to say, I mean,
yeah.
I've heard, obviously, I don't know from firsthand experience. It would be wonderful to work on set with De Palma, but I've not gotten to do that. But I mean, it's by all accounts, it sounds like he is extremely meticulous. That he, now, and this is antithesis to Herzog, which is kind of the roots of this podcast. We, and our origination was that we were discussing Werner Herzog specifically and exclusively. Of course, we've moved away from that now, and we talk about all different kinds of filmmakers and films. But apparently De Palma storyboards like his entire films, and
Interesting.
extremely meticulous and detail oriented towards and you have to be. I mean, I think that he's clearly extremely focused on the visual. But what I love to see, though, is that not to the detriment of performance, which can happen a lot of times to a director who's more technically inclined, who's more camera focused, who's more visual specific. A lot of times performances can falter, but they don't here, which is great. But yeah, I just you're right. I think when you said that it's like an evolution. I think we're all inspired by, it's like we saw somebody's work when we were a kid that kind of made us say, hey, I want to do that. Right. Yeah. So I think everybody, hopefully you go through a process where you take your inspiration and you add to it and you become your own thing. But that kind of core of what you were inspired by is always going to be present in your work. And nothing wrong with that at all.
No, I think you should engage with that rather than trying to. And I think De Palma does that beautifully. Instead of trying to splinter himself from it and go, I can't do that because it's not wholly original. But
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of wholly original, I mean, real quickly, I want to also toss in because I think this is kind of an interesting little tidbit. So I think most people probably know, but this film is an adaptation of a Stephen King novel. And I did not know this, but it actually was the first novel Stephen King had published. Now, it wasn't the first one he wrote. It was the fourth book that he had written, but it was the first to be published. And I think that's kind of interesting because nowadays, of course, we know Stephen King is Stephen King. It's like when he writes a book, I mean, it's Stephen King. I mean, he's made his own darn genre practically. But this is the first book he had ever had published. So he was just some guy with a book. I think it's pretty interesting that this was the story that De Palma chose to tell. I think I just think that's kind of interesting. Clearly, it was a good choice, and clearly Stephen King has gone on to be a profound talent. I just think that's an interesting,
like you said, a genre unto his own.
Yeah, it's just an interesting tidbit. All right, so with that, so let's talk a little bit more about. I mean, the cinematography. It's there were two cinematographers on this film. I did not know that either.
Me neither. Only one is credited.
And I'm not terribly familiar with either of the two of these DPs. But we start off with, and I hope I don't butcher this name, Isidore Mankovsky, and apparently there was some kind of conflict, probably a personality issue between De Palma and him, but he shot the first half of the film. And then we've got Mario Tosi, who shot this latter half of the film. And I think he's the credited cinematographer.
Yes, Mario Tosi,
Yeah, if I'm correct. So I don't know a ton about those two. Mario doesn't seem to have shot a lot of things, at least that was released here in North America. I know he's Italian, and so maybe he has some other work that was more regional or local that had been released. But I know that De Palma, I mean, again, we go back to he's so visually focused and so hands-on and he's designing shots. So I feel like I'd go out on a limb and maybe take a guess here that De Palma is more than 50% responsible for the look of the film. I'm going to guess that De Palma did probably 80% of what we see at least. I mean,
which is likely why you can't see a difference between the two. There's no jump of suddenly this feels like it's shot by somebody else.
Right.
And no matter even down to the techniques. I mean, again, I think you made the joke earlier, but that this movie has, I described it in our notes as like a super pro-mist, because for anyone who doesn't know, a pro-mist filter is it's like a kind of a fogged piece of glass, very lightly fogged piece of glass that you'd put in front in a matte box, or just sometimes there's screw-ons in front of a camera lens, and it basically blooms all of the highlights and softens out highlights and makes them look kind of nice. I have a 1/8 Pro Mist that I even think is too much sometimes. This seems like it was like a 1/2 or something. Like this, this seems
it's intense.
It's there's a lot of bloom. Not something that I would necessarily do on something that I was making, but I actually don't dislike the look of this movie at all. I think that it actually looks, it fits in. Honestly, what's funny is that it's like that look of that very bloomed, soft kind of look resonates a lot with the music, which we'll get into later. That like soft flute, it kind of matches that look really well. But yeah, so there's a lot of like very soft, not necessarily soft because of necessarily the stock or the film grain or anything like that, but rather just because it's very bloomy, the highlights. Shot on Eastman 100T 5254, which is of course another film that's not made these days, but has a very distinct look. The reds are super saturated,
and which of course is perfect for the blood. I mean, it's beautiful. And you know, I just because I hadn't looked and I wasn't for sure, but yeah, so that is sadly a discontinued stock. Of course, there are only a few film stocks that have survived to this point,
and even then, they're all contemporary stocks.
They're all contemporary, different stocks, But yeah, I think the bloom works well too. I think the Pro Mist works. I think that, you know, especially this is such a surreal film. This is almost like a fairy tale. You know, it's such a little self-contained. It's very small. It's
very dependent on trajectory of the plot. Like it's not necessarily plot heavy, but in terms of every scene is forwarding the events in some way, which I think is, you know, again, it makes this movie really tight and really neat and compact. But also doesn't, I don't know about you, I don't think it ever feels rushed or that it's like beating you over the head.
I mean, I appreciate the amount of time that De Palma takes in the first hour building up to the prom scene. I mean, we see all this, you know, we see, obviously, we immediately, our hearts go out to Carrie. We have this really, I mean, frankly, disturbing scene with her being bullied so horrifically about something that is, of course, you know, totally normal and no reason to bully. But yeah, my goodness, the fact that she was unprepared for her first period and didn't even really know what was going on because her mother hadn't told her anything about it, had kept her so cloistered off from the world. I mean, I can only fathom how devastating it would be to go through that. I mean, I was bullied for a few years in like junior high school until I got into high school, and thankfully that changed. But my God, it was like gym class was like your worst nightmare. If you were like being bullied, dude, gym class was like, this is the last place in the world you want to be, is in a locker room full of kids who are picking on you. It's the I never went through anything of the magnitude that she goes through, her character goes through in this film. But oh my gosh, so my heart goes out to her immediately. You have instant sympathy. And then the entire film, we see just the mechanizations, the wheels, the gears turning, everything building to what's going to happen to her. And we know exactly what's going to happen to her. I mean, it's clear as day. It's not like there's some mystery.
It's almost like a prophecy. Yeah.
We know that she is going to be tormented in a horrific public way at prom. And you know it from the instant that the other kids in class who are sentenced to detention because of what they did to Carrie, and of course they blame her, and so they feel like they need to get back at her, and so they devise this scheme.
One in particular too. It's the one girl,
Nancy Allen.
Nancy,
played the character played by Nancy Allen. So, but I mean, to go back to some cinematography, I mean. One of the other things, so you talked about this feeling like really feeling like a film from the 70s. I think the Pro Mist kind of gives it a sense of the 70s a little bit to me. Not that the Pro Mist was like a thing that every film used in the 70s, but I think in conjunction with, there's a lot of zooms.
Oh yeah, and I love the zooms in this movie.
I look, and you and I've talked about this, you know, and it's, I don't know why, but especially when I was first kind of starting out, and you know, I remember, you know, first few sets that I would get on, and I'm still learning the ropes, and I'm kind of figuring out what's what, and I'm like over there talking to the DP or something, and I'm used to using zoom lenses on my still cameras, right? Before I ever got it, had the, and on camcorders, not professional cameras, not cinema
like a
cameras.
Sony Handycam.
But when I was a kid, I had camcorders, and of course they all had zooms. They all had zooms, and so I'm like, oh, this is, I'm used to shoot like all my little home videos and everything. I'd shot with a zoom my whole life. And, I remember just saying the word on a set, would just like send, a DP off on a rant that would last 30 minutes about how, I wouldn't touch a zoom lens with a, 10-foot pole. Like, how dare you even, I only shoot with primes.
Which I think is so funny.
And I'm
it's like they're compensating for something.
No kidding, huh? And I'm like, I don't get it. I think zooms are not only do they have a huge logistical advantage. Obviously, there's drawbacks. I mean, they're slower, and there's other.
They're more expensive for a good one.
They're more expensive, and so I get all that. But my gosh, I mean, it's sad to me that the zoom is not used hardly at all. It's almost fallen. It's almost fallen from the grammar of filmmaking to this day. But I think zooms are used to great effect. They do such a wonderful job in these shots of pointing our attention to specific things. They really do a fantastic job of reframing, and when you combine that with the really fluid camera movement that we've got here, and
De Palma's like really, really world-class blocking.
It's world-class blocking. I mean, it's basically we're editing in camera. And not to take away from Paul Hirsch, the job that he did as an editor, especially during the prom scene with the split screen and all the cuts.
It's amazing.
I mean, that's really, I mean, that's extraordinary work, extraordinary. But I love that, when you can kind of edit in camera, when you can you can compose new scenes, you can move with characters, you can follow elements of the story. I think one of the most beautiful combinations of movement and zoom in this film is when we're at the prom and the bucket of blood is placed over her head. And we have this tracking shot where we're like, we're following characters, we're walking through the gym, then we come to like the side of the stage, we can see the rope going up, we follow it up to the bucket, we can see the entire, mechanism of how this is going to take place. What are those little what are those?
Rube Goldberg machine.
Yeah, it's almost like we're kind of the camera's like following the pieces of that, And it's like, okay, this is going to happen, then this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. And then, and we come up to the camera, we're on a crane, we come up and we're at the level of the bucket, and then we see Carrie and Tommy like off in the distance, and then we have this beautiful zoom past the bucket right onto them. Just ties so many different story elements together. Extraordinary shot. Yeah.
No, I agree. Again, it's one of those things where you like you said, you so rarely kind of see it these days, where it's like a dance between, which I think are some really important elements, the zoom, the camera movement itself, and the movement of the actors, and the way that they all play out together, I think is really remarkable. In very similar to kind of almost the way that Robert Altman. Sort of can compose a lot of scenes like that. Like he loves to use like a moving camera to recompose and to almost make scenes seem like they're wonders when they're not. And so I think that's quite interesting that De Palma does it here. Not surprising if you've seen any other De Palma movies, but like even up to Mission Impossible is shot very similarly. The first Mission Impossible, which of course De Palma did and is my favorite of the series.
Yeah, by far.
But you get a lot of I like directors like that who have such like an auteur status of, you can tell that no matter what genre they're doing, they're changing themselves to fit different genres, but they're at the same time there's still those little tidbits that are in there.
Well, and I think the other thing too is and especially with the rise in television that we have now, and we've talked about this probably a dozen times throughout these episodes, but we're exposed to such different content now, and I think sadly, another thing that I think separates cinema from TV or from video or from content is that there's really a focus on visual storytelling, on the camera being a character, having a voice, being a part of the storytelling. And I think true cinema, and I think this is an example, the camera is absolutely vital. What it does and how it does it is just as important a character as any other in the film.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think we've just, films ultimately, hopefully you have more budget, you have especially more time. And again, it's a director-driven medium, so you can do these kind of things. Sadly, I think a lot of filmmakers don't do this because I think we've gotten used to TV, where it's two-shot, over the shoulder, boom. It's just the camera's not doing anything. The camera is just sitting there.
Well, even like I think something that people forget so much about, and that I think that Schrader plays. I keep saying Schrader. De Palma. I don't know why
you want to
Schrader's
talk
on a
about
bright day.
Schrader? You want to?
Yeah. Maybe we've got to do Taxi Driver next.
Yeah,
but,
there you go.
But that De Palma does is, and again, when it, like very much in line with what you're saying, is that placement and positioning from camera, that how far are people from camera. There's a lot of shots in this movie where the people delivering dialogue or the people that are the center of attention are actually quite far from camera, or sometimes again with these split diopter shots where it's like people are having a conversation looking the same direction. One of them is a foot from the camera, one of them is 50 feet from the camera, and you've got these, even when they're doing the gym exercises outside, you've got the coach that's standing right at camera, and then the girl Chris, who's kind of the orchestrator of the prank, complaining, and she's like complaining in the background, and they're having this conversation while they're so far from each other, and I love it. And playing, I think, again, just like the distance from camera can tell you so much, whether an actor or a character moves towards camera or we move towards them, whether the way, the speed in which they move. It's things like that I think so many people just forget about and kind of skim over, because it's like, okay, let's set up a camera, or what's even more common these days, let's set up 3 cameras, capture all the coverage in one shot, in one take, and we've got what we need to see what happens in the scene, and we're moving on. It's not nobody. Well, and I don't want to see nobody in a literal sense, but very few mainstream directors that you would be able to see on a big screen today take the time to go, okay, like how can I use the relationship between all of these elements, all these moving pieces in a scene to tell a story. I think we talked about this before too, that the idea that like a lot of movies, I think the way that you can tell whether or not a film is, or a director is doing their job as well as they should be, is if you watch a movie on mute. And while there of course is a important dialogue in any movie, and dialogue is important, and storytelling audibly is important, I think this is also a movie that if you watch this on mute, you would still get a gist of what's going on, what the characters are feeling,
question.
who's doing
question.
what.
No question, 100%. And I know, too, from just watching, De Palma interviews, hearing him speak. I mean, it is such an important part. It's such a huge part of what he focuses on. And it's just really wonderful to see, and it's an inspiration to me, and it's something that I definitely strive for in my work. And I feel, sadly, I mean, I don't know what to say. I feel like, I mean, it's not to say that cameras don't move in other films. I mean, sure, they move, but there's just a difference. And I could probably do a better job of articulating it than I am, but take, like your average Avengers movie or Marvel movie. I mean, the camera's all over place and all over the place in those films. It's certainly.
Well, half the time it's virtual too.
Well, right. And you're right. Probably more than half, probably 3/4 of the time. There's not even a camera actually there. But it's really about movement with purpose, and specifically storytelling purpose. And I just remember too, and this is something that Herzog and De Palma definitely do agree on. So unlike storyboarding, that coverage is a naughty word. And I totally agree with this. And I know people, and I've worked with people who are the exact opposite, and it makes me crazy. And it's not a way that I ever want to work. And, frankly, that's one of the first things I kind of find out about. If there's a cinematographer I want to work with and they love coverage, then it's not a good match. Yeah. I believe that you go in and you have an extremely specific idea of what you're wanting to do, and you're executing that exact specific thing. to go in and just shoot, just get a bunch of generic crap. Okay, we're going to get this extra wide and then a wide and then, and just we're going to cover it from every different possible angle. And then, okay, we'll have all these options when we get into editing and then we can just do whatever we want. Mm-hmm. That always turns out crap. I feel like that always turns out crap.
Yeah. And I think it's actually fun, a personal anecdote that when I was shooting on set last week. On the shot list, there was one scene that was a single shot conversation between three characters at a table. Mm-hmm. And in the shot list, I had written as a secondary shot, get one insert shot, just a piece of coverage of one of the actors, just in case I need to cut to it. And we did the scene, I think we did like 3 or 4 takes of it in the initial setup, that master. And I looked at it, and I looked at the my friend Adam, who was my first AD, and I said, "We're cutting that. I don't need the coverage." And he was like, "Are you sure? Like, you don't want something for safety?" And I was like, "Nope, I don't need it. Like, I only put it there just in case I needed it, but I know for a fact that I don't need it because it would completely kill the rhythm of the scene. And I'm not in the business of just taking shots because I'm worried about something. I'm in the business of planning. So yeah, I just think it's funny that we're talking about all this stuff about coverage and stuff, and it was an experience I just had. But do you want to get into maybe some of the performances?
Absolutely.
Like Sissy Spacek in this movie, who is of course Carrie, who is a wonderful, wonderful actor.
Oh my gosh,
generally,
isn't she great?
She's incredible in this movie. And how old was she? Do you know how old she was in this?
Boy, she's young. She's early 20s.
She was young in Badlands. I think she was only...
She might have been 16 or something in Badlands. She was extremely young in Badlands. We can check that out real quick. But while you're looking that up, I mean, so Sissy Spacek as Carrie White is amazing. Piper Laurie as her mother, Margaret White, is extraordinary. And, both of them received Academy Award nominations for acting, which was really, unheard of in a horror movie, genre film, even to this day. I mean, that's like, wow,
Yeah.
So, definitely. But I thought all the performances were good. John Travolta has a little supporting role in here, I think is great. Amy Irving, I think this is her very first film. Of course, she would go on to marry Spielberg. Speaking of kind of closely knit. Yeah. But they were all, I thought all the performances were really fantastic.
It was one of the things that I'd mentioned beforehand, too, when we were discussing the film, which was just that it was like, there's no weak link here.
No.
They honestly all feel like very authentic high schoolers, even though they are much older. And I think it works because I think in this sense, unlike Grease, like John Travolta, I don't think is supposed to be I think he's supposed to be her boyfriend, who's
older boyfriend. Yeah. Because he's never in school.
No, and he just kind of shows up to the thing, and but everyone else, again, despite looking older, there's a really real relationship between everyone, which is kind of rare to find in like high school drama movies, which is not, of course, what this is, but there's elements of that in this film. And I think it's really rare to find situations like that feel real. And I think what makes this movie feel so real is the brutality and the authenticity of the performances and just De Palma's direction. So you have Carrie, of course, again in that opening scene, that like horrific bullying that she faces. You've just got this very raw feeling of it, and all the performances are incredibly just grounded down to earth. They are doing what they are doing, and then when they're in detention and they all start arguing, of course there's an element of it that's heightened because it's a film, but it also still feels like you really buy into it, or at least I did. I felt like these were real people, and that the drama of it made sense. It's authentic. It feels genuine, which is, I think, in huge part owing to the fact that these actors were all really great. And correct me if I'm wrong, most of them were pretty much no names at this point, with the exception of Sissy Spacek, who had been and of course some of the adult.
But this
actors.
Was her breakout. Badlands
wasn't
Laurie,
something that made her big, but
Now, Piper Laurie definitely Piper Laurie definitely had a substantial career before this film. But as a matter of fact, but she came off a long break, which is interesting. Piper Laurie, so she hadn't done a film since '61, and the last film she had done was The Hustler. and she had been actually nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress in BAFTA, Gold, like New York Film Critics Circle Award. I mean, so she got a lot of accolade for her role in The Hustler, but that's 1961. So we're fast forwarding now to 76.
Wow. She took a Malick break.
She took she took a Malick break of 15 years. So, but she had definitely had experience, but I think she's just fantastic here. I mean, and I love the choices that she made. So, I mean, first and foremost, I mean, she's got to play this really challenging role as a mother to communicate authentically this like religious obsessed repressed force that has ground Carrie into this this tiny little ball of a human being that is just so profoundly repressed and oppressed
and reactionary
and it's just so terrifying, and she did such a wonderful job. And then in that, oh my gosh, the final, in the kind of the epilogue, if you will, kind of almost of after, after the prom event where Carrie burns the school down and we have all of this action there. Carrie comes back to the house, and she comes back and she wants to be embraced by her mother, because it's kind of like, what you said did happen. You said they were going to laugh at me, and I guess you were right. And I have nothing. Can you hold me? And oh my, her mother stabs her in the back, literally stabs her in the back, but you believe it. And it's like, it's hard to pull off, but you also have some sympathy, because you wonder, like, I mean, you get little pieces, right? It's like Carrie's father left the family, and the mother has devised,
they had them out of wedlock,
devised this like this idea that Satan took her husband away. So I mean, she herself is repressed and is just self-loathing, and we feel that, and so we have sympathy for her. She's not just this two-dimensional or one-dimensional cardboard cutout kind of character, which it could easily have gone into. And it could also,
the remake is very much that. I think Julianne Moore plays the mother, and it's just quite.
And she's a good actress. Julianne Moore. It's not like she's a hack. I mean, she's a great actress. So goes to show that's not easy. It's really not easy. So we have sympathy for her. She feels like a real character. And we've all seen flavors of that in other people, or maybe even in ourselves. Not to that extreme, of course. But I think it's a very relatable kind of feeling in general. But then that end where she's crucified by Carrie with the telepathically sent cutlery, and she's literally crucified with her arms outstretched, and she
nailed to the door frame,
and she plays it as an ecstasy, as opposed to a pain. And
it's like she's fulfilling her purpose.
She's fulfilling her martyrdom, and I know from watching some BTS on this that was her suggestion to De Palma.
Interesting,
instead of just playing this straight, like, oh, I'm in pain, what if this were something that actually gave me pleasure? And God, does it work, because it's terrifying.
The music in that moment is so great. When the mother's, that final confrontation, the music is really. It is the cherry on top of.
Let's talk about that too a little bit.
Yeah.
So
there's actually an interesting tidbit about the music too that you had found out, which was that De Palma initially wanted Bernard Herrmann, who he worked on with his two previous films and who was scoring Taxi Driver this time. But Herrmann, who is of course known as the Hitchcock's go-to composer, who I love. I love Bernard Herrmann so much. But he passed away in the recording sessions, not actually in, but during the recording sessions, the final kind of mixing of Taxi Driver. So De Palma couldn't get him. So instead, it is Pino Donaggio, who hasn't done much other film work. If you look at his credits, he's not done. This was certainly the biggest that he had done. I think he did. I can't remember what. There was another thing on his list that he'd done that was relatively big, but this was certainly the largest movie.
One of the higher profile,
but no, I actually really like. It kind of. There's only really three kind of pieces of music in this. There's the softer flute that kind of goes on during, of course, the nicer scenes, and sometimes is played during creepier moments as kind of a juxtaposition.
Kind of represents a little more of Carrie's vulnerability.
Yes,
Yeah.
And then there's the actual hit when Carrie uses her, telekinesis, which sounds, it's the exact same chord as the Psycho hit, which explains, the
strings
between Herman and perhaps De Palma would have wanted Herman to almost recreate that sound as well. And then there's that score when the mother's dying, which comes up only a few other times in the movie, I think. And it's like this really nice melody that sounds really nice, but it's tragic. Like it's just brooding with this tragic sound that I think personally, I'm not somebody who ever thinks that music should tell somebody what to feel or
be on the nose.
The forefront. But I love music and film when it's used really well, and I don't even mind it if it's really loud and big and forward, as long as it's serving a purpose beyond just saying be sad. And I think that scene is actually a really perfect example of it, and I think marries into this whole idea of martyrdom from the mother's perspective perfectly. Because you feel that as Carrie like covers her ears as she's kind of doing her last dying breath, there's this. It's not like a horror score in that moment. It's like this really tragic, but almost grand, almost fulfilling feeling song. And I think it's really, really well done.
Yeah, I would agree. And you definitely do get the homage, if you will, or there's a lot of stylistic similarities in this score between what you could imagine that Bernard Herrmann might have done. You could definitely imagine that this would be something, that he would have done kind of along these lines.
Yeah, because Herrmann loves the strings, he loves the flutes, he loves, it definitely, I can tell that De Palma was really trying to kind of pay homage to him, especially considering he had just passed away.
And knowing knowing De Palma had intended to hire him for the film, but was sadly unable to. Wow. Well, I think that about covers it, man.
Yeah.
It's these films are fun. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Sometimes I'm like, even though yes, it comes from like it's De Palma's name on it, and it's kind of so it has a bit of a pedigree there. But it's like maybe this is my little attempt to like ease into some more genre films. So I'll start with something that's more acceptable, like a De Palma flick, and then I could kind of maybe next time I'll pick something even a little more. Maybe I'll start getting into like something from Carpenter or something. But we'll see.
We'll see. Awesome. Yeah.
but I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed this one. And it's really fun to talk about, and hey, who knows, maybe we'll do another De Palma film down the road, because I think his work really is worth watching and talking about. If I ever have an opportunity to expose some new people to De Palma, then I'm super excited to do that. So, but anyway, well, we'll be excited for your pick next time. I look forward to that, and everybody out there who's like stayed along and listen to us discuss Carrie. We appreciate you doing so. We hope you enjoyed it. Cullen, thanks as always. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, see ya.